You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. This episode is brought to you by Calxequin. The foundation of a horse's well-being is a strong hoof. That's why Calxequin, the new daily hoof support supplement from the makers of Cosequin, contains key ingredients such as biotin, amino acids, copper, and zinc to support hoof integrity, quality growth, strength, and durability. What sets Calxequin apart from other hoof supplements is the inclusion of vitamin E and selenium, which provide antioxidant support and membrane stabilization. Put your best hoof forward with Calxequin. To learn more, visit calxequin.com. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and today my guest is Dr. Carey Williams, equine extension specialist and professor at Rutgers University. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Hailey. It's great being here.
So we're going to jump right into our topic, which is managing mud in horse pastures. And I know right now for a lot of us, it's hard to think about mud because we're dealing with snow and ice. And where I am in Pennsylvania, we just got several inches of snow unexpectedly yesterday. So I'm not thinking about mud just yet, but pretty soon we will be. So I wanted to discuss this before anybody's struggling with it. So to start us off, could you tell us what some of the problems and dangers that mud can cause on horse farms might be?
Yes, absolutely. And actually New Jersey is right in the same boat. We're pretty frozen solid right now, and I know we're expecting some really cold weather, but yeah, I think farmers always need to kind of keep in mind the possibilities of mud because there are a lot of problems, not just with horses, which we'll get to in a minute, but with humans as well. It can be pretty dangerous. And I know at Rutgers University, anytime we have to deal with mud, we have to worry about student safety as well and the handler of the animals, because if they go into a field that's really muddy and they need to move quickly or get out of the way, they could slip in the mud, fall and hurt themselves. Or, I've even had boots that are slip-on boots slip off because of mud, and then you have real issues and problems. So it can be a problem for the farmer and the animal handler. But even more so for the horses. There are a lot of health issues that can come from mud when animals, horses in particular, are standing in mud. And if you think about it, it's a lot of hoof issues like thrush, hoof cracks, white line disease, hoof abscesses. And then as you move up the hoof, you get into skin issues like scratches, which is bacterial and fungal infection of the skin, rain rot. They can even have some tendon issues if they end up slipping in the mud, just like I was talking about with the humans slipping in the mud. Our horses can too. So really, mud is not just a problem for the people that have to work in it, but the animals as well.
Yeah, so you briefly listed some of those health issues. Could you describe them in a little bit more depth, what they might look like? I mean, I know some people deal with thrush pretty often, and that's a common one. But for example, the tendon issues is something I didn't think about, so I'm sure people would like to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, horses, granted, some of us don't always have the most well-behaved horse. I'm going to preface that. I come from a lot of off-the-track thoroughbred type horses. So, they're going to want to run around the field. They're going to want to play. Well, as you can imagine, having good footing is really important because if they do have any slips or tweaks, there's so many tendons that run up the back of their leg, just behind their cannon bone. And you can get even just as easily as like a strain of a tendon, but you can even get things as severe as like a bowed tendon, which is a severe inflammation. They can even get some tendon tears if it goes that far, just by not having good footing to run around on. I know some older horses might be a little more careful and aware of their footing, but not all horses are, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk a little bit more about the skin issues and if there's any ways to maybe even prevent them from happening? I know my horse, when he stands in mud, almost always gets scratches, and I have yet to find a good way to prevent that from happening.
Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So yeah, scratches and rain rot are very similar. They can either be bacterial or fungal, just infections in the skin. And if you think about it, anytime an animal stays really wet for a long period of time, and in this case, we're talking about them standing in mud and their ankles or their fetlocks down, even sometimes over the fetlocks and in the pastern region, can have some of these bacterial infections. So what'll happen is the skin it'll have some oozing, and then it'll scab over, and it can become very inflamed and even infected. So you really need to remove the scabs that are on there. I know everybody says, don't ever pick scabs. Well, in this case, you need to pick them. And then you need to apply a topical ointment on that skin. But even more importantly, you need to make sure the animal has time to dry out. So that's when it gets to be a problem with the mud. As if you don't have a place to put them that is dry. I've seen some people have good luck with wrapping the legs. I'm not really a fan of wrapping legs when you're putting them back in the mud. You're just looking for trouble. But really, it's about just getting them dried out. And I know some management situations might be a little hard to find areas where they're going to be dry for a long period of time, especially when we end up getting a lot of rain, say in the spring season. But I think for dealing with any topical treatments or things like that, or even sometimes it goes as far as needing something systemic, I would encourage people to work with their veterinarian. Really, they're going to know the best source, and they're going to probably be able to tell if it is fungal or bacterial and be able to give you a better solution.
Awesome. So what would be the best ways, if there are any at all, to prevent mud from forming before it happens on your farm?
Yes, that is a great question. And I always like to say it's best to prevent. And I know a lot of people can't do this, but it's really ideal if you can plan ahead before the farm is even built. So the really lucky people are those that buy farms that are either non-existent or there's a lot of flexibility where they can recreate and redirect the water, because that's a big thing. So site selection is important. Anybody who is lucky enough to have this situation should really look at taking care of or taking advantage of higher ground. Try to find good drainage areas. And really, if you're even out there looking for a plot of land to have a farm, don't just buy it when you look at it, say in the end of summer months, as we've had a month-long drought. Go several times, take a look at it during different times of the year, or maybe even swing by the property after a big rainstorm. I've had several friends that keep telling me they wish they would have done this before they bought their property, and that way you can really see. So there's a bunch of other ways too, if you do have an existing property but want to be a little bit better about taking care of the land for mud. And that's making sure that any of the buildings on the property, especially barns or big hay storage, things like that, make sure that they're using the rain gutters, because diverting any excess water away from the paddocks or away from pastures is the best way to do it. Yeah, we can't control necessarily the rain that lands right on the paddock, but we can take the rain that lands on the barn and then all goes into the paddock next to the barn. We can divert that away from that particular paddock. So there's a bunch of different ways we can do that, and gutters are one of them. Also using things like buffer areas around paddocks. So they might be like a big grassy area. Some people might have heard the term rain garden. And really, these are just areas of plants that are planted there to increase their water uptake, or they do increase a lot of water uptake. So they kind of help dry the areas out a little better. And again, not all farms have access or ability to do these, but there are a couple things that aren't too expensive that they can do.
This episode is brought to you by Calxequin. The foundation of a horse's well-being is a strong hoof. That's why Calxequin, the new daily hoof support supplement from the makers of Cosequin, contains key ingredients such as biotin, amino acids, copper, and zinc to support hoof integrity, quality growth, strength, and durability. What sets Calxequin apart from other hoof supplements is the inclusion of vitamin E and selenium, which provide antioxidant support and membrane stabilization. Put your best hoof forward with Calxequin. To learn more, visit calxequin.com. So I know that some people, especially in my area, will suggest giving pastures a period of rest, because most farms, I would say around here at least, do have the space to do that. But I know some smaller farms, or for example, I have two minis at home who have to stay on the dry lot paddock, don't really have the option to give certain areas a rest. So what could you do in those situations to minimize mud?
Yeah, that's a great question. Without getting into a whole another podcast on pasture management and rotational grazing, because I am definitely a huge believer in rotational grazing, but I think a big thing is you really need to try to have availability of a sacrifice lot. You can say sacrifice lot or dry lot or something along those lines. And this is if you can't completely rest the whole entire field, at least you have a portion of the field that you can pull the horses off of. So that way, when it is really wet, they're not going to just continue to tear up the field because horses have a really well-designed hoof that is ideal for tearing up ground, especially when you have horses, like I mentioned earlier, that like to run around the fields. And that just stirs up the ground. We really want to try to keep the root base of the grasses intact because that's what's going to help uptake or continue to prevent the water from sitting. So, everybody thinks about their fields where there is mud. It's in areas that are usually don't have a lot of grass. So the more grass you can have, the less mud you'll probably have as well. So using those sacrifice areas, you can keep all of the food, the water, the places where horses congregate in one particular area. And then you can also just have a smaller area where you can consider installing a heavy use pad. That's kind of a general term for something that might have a stone base or a gravel base, or even using some geotextile or another layer of footing like gravel or wood chips or sand or something along those lines, just to try to keep that particular area higher and drier. And that, it can't really be done in large pastures across the whole field. So it's ideal just to pick a smaller area and prepare it so that you don't have all that mud accumulate. And actually, while I'm on that subject, there's one thing I just remembered as well. Where you have mud, you typically have more organic matter. So what does that mean? Well, that means manure, and that means any wasted feed like hay. So you always see where horses congregate, they poop, and where they eat, they waste hay. So it's really a good idea to, in those areas especially, remove the manure on a regular basis and clean up any wasted hay, because that alone will really help decrease the amount of mud that you're going to have in that particular area.
Yeah, I know that most people probably struggle with mud, especially by the gates. And at least at the farms that I've seen, that's often where you throw hay during the winter, and that's where the horses are standing more. So I see some people put down, like you mentioned, like footing or something like that to help with the mud there. Do they need to redo that footing frequently to keep it useful, or is it okay to do it once and then leave it be?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because as I was rattling off all of the different types of footing you can use, I was kind of thinking that because, for instance, wood chips, that's a great temporary solution. The wood is dry. It might absorb some of the water. It's going to keep it dry. However, wood, as we all know as farmers, breaks down. So as it breaks down and as it kind of gets covered in more of the manure and mud and incorporates into the soil, you're going to have to keep reapplying and re-adding it. So anywhere you use wood chips, shavings, something like that, expect it to be a very temporary solution. Depending on how much water and how much traffic you have, it might be, I don't even want to give a time frame, but it might be quite regularly. However, if you actually go about it correctly by you'll remove the soil that's there, and you can add in different layers of stone and other footing like gravel, and then use that geotextile, you're pretty well set. I don't want to say forever, but a while. And this is actually what we did at Rutgers in a couple areas around our gates and feeders. Oh, I want to say maybe 10 years ago. And we've got quite a bit of horse traffic, and they're still holding up pretty well. Yeah, I want to say when we have some 100-year storms and, when we're underwater for weeks, there might be some mud there, but for the most part, they're much, much drier than they've been in the past, and they've really held up quite well. So it really does depend on what you're going to choose, but then it also really depends on how much you want to spend. Doing the heavy use areas and using the fabric and actually excavating a small area is going to be a little more expensive than just doing wood chips, but you don't need to redo it very often. So that's the good thing.
So as you mentioned earlier, preventing mud is best and a lot easier than trying to catch up once it's already started. So when would be the best time for farm managers to start preparing their pastures for spring?
I think the easy answer is really just whenever you can get on your fields. So you mentioned in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and pretty much the whole Northeast, it's pretty frozen and covered in snow. So obviously you're not going to be able to do anything now. As it thaws, okay, yeah, you might want to start thinking about it, but it's also not a good idea to start putting in a bunch of heavy equipment into your fields that are really going to tear it up even more unless you plan on completely, redoing that particular area. So, I would say spring is a good idea, but it also comes with a lot of challenges. So some farms might even want to just wait to make those big changes in the fields until the fall. We get a period of time where it is a little bit drier. It's before the snow, before it freezes, that sort of thing. And that way you're ready to go in the spring and you don't need to worry about trying to get in there. When can I get in my field? And, oh, everything just thawed and now everything's a muddy mess, etc. So, so I would say it's probably really area dependent. But I would start looking into the fall. And that's usually when we recommend, if anyone's going to do any pasture renovation as well, that you aim for fall, sort of end of September, at least in our area. Some areas that might get away with a little bit later.
So I have one more question for you, and this is one that I ask all of my guests about their respective topic. And that would be, what is one common misconception that you often hear about mud on horse farms?
I think the biggest one here is that people think there's nothing they can do about it. Oh, I have this existing property and it has a lot of water and that's just the way it is. There's always something. You might not get rid of all of the mud, but there's always something they can do. Whether, like I mentioned, it's just easy as installing gutters on your barn or just, redirecting water in a certain way, or the heavy use pads. There's always something that can be done. It just depends on the length or extent that the farmer wants to go through. So I think that would be probably my biggest misconception with mud.
Yeah, I'll throw myself under the bus here. I've totally thought that, especially as I mentioned with my minis who have a dry lot, which I'm lucky that they have a decent amount of space for their dry lot, but it does get muddy, obviously, as the snow and ice melt or when we get heavy rains. And I'm totally guilty of saying, oh, well, this is just how it is. But now I've learned that there's definitely some things that I can do to get ahead of it.
There definitely is. And again, it really just depends on what you want to put into it. So
Absolutely. So that's all the time we have for today, but it's been great talking with you today, Dr. Williams. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. This was really enjoyable, and I hope everybody learned a little bit today.
And thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management Podcast to a friend.